The courtroom was nothing like the cozy classroom Emily was used to. It wasn't filled with cheerful posters, crayons, or friendly voices. Instead, it felt massive, towering, and cold, with its high ceilings and walls that echoed every shuffle of feet and whisper from the benches. The polished wooden benches stretched out endlessly, filled with strangers who sat silently, staring toward the front where the trial was about to unfold. At the center of it all sat Emily, just 8 years old. Her tiny legs dangled above the ground as she perched nervously on a wooden chair that felt far too big for her. She swung her legs absent-mindedly, a nervous habit she couldn't stop, as though the gentle movement could somehow carry her far away from this frightening place. Her small fingers twisted the hem of her dress until the fabric wrinkled. She looked around the room and saw nothing familiar, only stern faces, serious expressions, and men in suits flipping through papers. The sound of the prosecutor's voice, low and firm as he spoke with the judge, only made her stomach tighten further. This wasn't a place for a child. And yet she was here, because her words could change everything. Emily had been told she was brave, told that her testimony was important. But those words didn't matter now. The moment her eyes flickered toward the defense table, her courage crumbled. There sat the man she had tried so hard not to remember, the man accused of doing something so wrong, something that had stolen her innocence far too soon. His very presence made her throat close up. She could feel his gaze on her, sharp and heavy, like a shadow she couldn't escape. Her heart pounded so loudly in her chest that she was sure everyone could hear it. Every time she tried to swallow, her throat felt tight, dry. She thought about the words she was supposed to say, the truth she had promised to share. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came out. The words tangled inside, trapped by the fear that if she spoke, she'd relive it all over again. The prosecutor, a woman with kind but worried eyes, gave her an encouraging nod from across the room. Emily tried to hold on to that small comfort, but her gaze kept drifting back to the defendant. His expression was calm, almost smug, as though he believed she would never have the courage to speak. That thought terrified her more than anything. What if he was right? The judge lifted his gavel and struck it once, the sharp crack echoing through the courtroom. Emily flinched. It reminded her of slamming doors, of nights when she would hide under her blanket, praying the sounds would stop. She curled her fingers into fists, trying to make herself smaller in her chair. People were waiting for her. She could feel it, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her fragile shoulders. Jurors leaned forward, the audience sat in silence, and the reporters at the back readied their pens. They all wanted to hear her voice, but Emily felt as though she had none left. Her mother sat on the bench behind her, tears already gathering in her eyes. Emily wanted nothing more than to run to her, to bury her face in her mother's arms, and pretend this day didn't exist. But she couldn't. The adults had told her over and over again, "You're the only one who can do this. Your words matter." But how could a little girl like her carry such a heavy responsibility? The defense attorney cleared his throat impatiently, and Emily's fear deepened. She looked down at her shoes, white sneakers scuffed at the toes, and wished she could disappear inside them. She was just a child. She wasn't supposed to be here in this room full of laws, rules, and strangers waiting to dissect her every word. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly at her. His voice softened, though it still carried the authority of the bench. "Emily," he said gently, "do you feel ready to speak?" She swallowed hard, her lips parting, but only silence came out. Her cheeks flushed hot, and she shook her head slightly. The courtroom grew tense. A murmur rippled across the benches as people exchanged worried glances. Emily's eyes welled with tears. She felt trapped, caught between the truth she wanted to tell and the terror of telling it. Every second felt heavier than the last, and her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. Her gaze darted around the room again, desperate for an escape. She found none. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling taller than ever. She thought about the night she was first told she'd have to come here. Her mother had held her close and whispered, "You don't have to be afraid. The truth will protect you." But in this courtroom, with the defendant sitting just feet away, the truth felt like the scariest thing in the world. The prosecutor leaned closer, speaking softly. "Take your time, Emily. You don't have to rush." But Emily couldn't. Every time she tried to imagine speaking, she saw the man's face in her mind, his shadow looming over her. She squeezed her eyes shut and shook her head again, whispering so quietly the judge had to lean forward to hear. "I can't." The words broke the silence, fragile and heartbreaking. The prosecutor's shoulders sagged, and a ripple of unease spread across the room. Without Emily's testimony, the case would weaken. Without her voice, the man sitting across from her might walk free. Everyone knew it. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful, almost troubled. This wasn't the first time he'd seen a child freeze under the pressure of testifying. But something about this moment struck him differently. The fear in Emily's eyes wasn't simple stage fright. It was the kind of fear that left scars. He couldn't ignore it. He tapped his pen against the desk and cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we need to find another way." All eyes turned to him. Emily looked up, her tears still fresh, but curiosity flickering faintly in her expression. Another way? She didn't know what that meant. But the thought that she might not have to face this nightmare alone stirred the tiniest spark of hope in her heart. And for the first time that morning, Emily allowed herself to wonder. Maybe, just maybe, there was something, or someone, who could help her find her voice again. The silence in the courtroom felt heavy, pressing against every wooden wall and polished bench. Emily's small whisper, "I can't," still lingered in the air like a fragile echo. The little girl sat trembling, her hands clenched in her lap, her head bowed as though she had failed. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances, and the attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For a moment, it seemed the trial had stopped entirely, held hostage by the fear of an 8-year-old child. Judge Hamilton, an experienced man in his 60s with kind eyes hidden behind wire-rimmed glasses, studied the scene intently. His career had spanned decades. He had presided over cases involving hardened criminals, victims of all ages, and testimonies that could shatter even the strongest souls. But nothing ever pierced his heart, quite like the sight of a child on the witness stand, struggling to summon courage that most adults would barely manage. He leaned back in his chair, tapping the side of his gavel against the block, though not striking it. His mind raced. He knew the law demanded testimony, but he also knew the law could not demand bravery where none remained. Emily's silence wasn't a refusal, it was a cry for help, a plea that only someone with compassion could answer. The prosecutor glanced up at the judge with desperation in her eyes. She mouthed silently, "Please," hoping for some sign that he would intervene. The defense attorney, meanwhile, leaned back smugly, his lips curling into the faintest smirk. He knew that without the child's voice, the case could collapse like a house of cards. To him, the girl's silence wasn't tragedy. It was opportunity. The judge caught that smirk, and his jaw tightened. It was moments like these that tested not only the letter of the law, but the spirit of justice itself. Judge Hamilton leaned forward, his voice calm but steady. "Emily," he said gently, "you are very brave just for being here today. I want you to know that no one expects you to be perfect. We only ask you to tell the truth when you are ready." Emily raised her eyes, watery and uncertain. His tone was unlike the booming authority she expected. Instead, it carried a softness that wrapped around her like a blanket. Still, her lips trembled, and no sound came. The judge turned toward the attorneys. "I must consider the circumstances," he said. "This witness is a child. The environment we ask her to speak in is intimidating, even for grown men and women." His eyes swept over the jury, the lawyers, the courtroom filled with strangers, before resting again on the defendant. And intimidation, whether spoken or unspoken, cannot be ignored. The prosecutor nodded eagerly. "Your Honor, the child is willing. She simply needs help. We must find a way to give her the comfort and support she deserves." The defense attorney quickly rose to his feet. "Objection," he said firmly. "This is a courtroom, not a playground. If the witness cannot testify, then perhaps her testimony should be considered unreliable." Gasps murmured through the audience, and Emily's mother clenched her hands together, holding back tears. The very idea of discarding her daughter's words as unreliable felt like a cruel betrayal of justice. Judge Hamilton's gaze turned sharp, and he fixed the defense attorney with a look that silenced him instantly. "This is not about convenience," the judge said, his voice firm now. "This is about fairness. This is about ensuring that a child, called here by the law, is able to speak without being crushed by fear." The room quieted. Even the defendant shifted uneasily, the judge's words cutting through the smugness he had worn moments before. Emily, though still trembling, looked at the judge with a flicker of gratitude. His words mattered. For the first time since she had entered the courtroom, she felt like someone truly understood how scared she was. The judge sighed softly and leaned back. He remembered a case years ago, when another child had broken down on the stand. Back then, there were no special measures, just cold procedures that left scars. That memory haunted him still, and he swore never to let it happen again. He had seen too much trauma, too many young lives burdened by the weight of silence. This time, he would do something different. Turning to the bailiff, he said quietly, "Please step outside. There may be another option." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. What did the judge mean? What option? Even the prosecutor tilted her head curiously. Emily's mother leaned forward, her voice trembling as she whispered to her daughter, "It's okay, sweetheart. Someone is going to help." The judge watched Emily carefully. Her wide eyes followed the bailiff as he exited the courtroom. For a brief moment, curiosity seemed to distract her from her fear. She tilted her head, wondering what was happening, what this other option could possibly be. Judge Hamilton spoke directly to her again. "Emily, sometimes we all need a little help to feel strong. That doesn't make us weak, it makes us human." His voice softened further. "Would you feel better if you had a friend here with you? Someone who could sit by your side?" Emily blinked, surprised by the question. Friend?" she whispered. The judge nodded. "Yes, someone who'll stay with you the whole time. You won't have to face this alone." The little girl hesitated, her fingers loosening slightly from their tight grip on her dress. She thought about what it would mean to have a friend here, someone who wouldn't judge her, someone who wouldn't leave her side. Slowly, she nodded. The prosecutor smiled softly, relief washing over her face. The audience held their breath, curious about what would happen next. The defense attorney scowled, clearly irritated by this unexpected turn. Moments later, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open again. All eyes turned as the bailiff stepped back inside. Behind him, a sound of paws echoed faintly against the floor. A murmur rippled through the benches. People craned their necks to see. Emily's eyes widened in wonder as a large, calm German shepherd padded into the room, his harness shining with the emblem of the police. The judge's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Emily," he said gently, "meet Justice." The dog's handler guided him toward the front, his movements steady, his demeanor peaceful. Emily stared, her fear momentarily forgotten. And in that instant, everything in the courtroom began to change. The courtroom held its breath. After the bailiff slipped out, the air seemed to thicken with questions. The jurors leaned in, their pens paused above their notepads. Reporters exchanged glances, unsure if this was a mere recess or the start of something extraordinary. Even the defendant shifted uncomfortably, his confidence flickering as the judge's unusual order lingered in the air. Emily sat frozen on the witness chair, her eyes still glistening with tears. She didn't understand exactly what was happening, but she knew something had changed. For the first time since she'd walked into this intimidating chamber, there was a hint of curiosity in her gaze, rather than pure terror. The judge leaned forward again, his tone gentle but steady. "Emily," he said softly, "sometimes when we are afraid, it helps to have a friend. Not the kind who speaks, not the kind who asks you for anything, but the kind who simply sits with you and makes you feel safe. Would you like that?" Emily tilted her head, her small hands resting nervously in her lap. "A friend?" She whispered again, the word fragile on her lips. "Yes," the judge said with a reassuring nod. "Someone who will not leave your side, no matter what you say. Someone who will be right here, close enough for you to touch." The little girl looked down at her shoes, then back at the judge. She thought about school, about the time she had stood on the playground alone, wishing someone would sit with her, wishing she had the kind of friend who made her feel less small. Slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. The prosecutor's shoulders relaxed slightly, her lips curving into a faint smile. Hope flickered across her face. She crouched down a little, lowering herself to Emily's eye level. "You're very brave, Emily," she said quietly, her voice warm and kind. "And sometimes brave people still need a hand to hold, or, in this case, maybe something even better." Emily's brow furrowed. "Better than a hand?" The prosecutor's eyes twinkled, though she didn't answer directly. Instead, she gave the girl an encouraging smile. "You'll see." The defendant scowled, clearly irritated by the diversion. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering something harsh under his breath. The defense attorney raised his hand to object, but caught the sharp look of Judge Hamilton and quickly lowered it. There was nothing in the rule book that forbade comfort, though he knew that whatever was coming might tip the scales against them. A silence stretched on. The only sounds were the scratch of a pen, the faint creak of the judge's chair, and Emily's uneven breaths. Every eye in the room turned toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. Then it happened. The latch clicked, the doors creaked, and the bailiff stepped inside once more. But he wasn't alone. Emily's eyes grew wide. Behind the bailiff padded a large figure tall on 4 legs, sleek fur glinting under the overhead lights. The sound of claws clicking against the polished floor echoed softly as the animal entered the room with calm, measured strides. Gasps rippled through the benches. A few jurors leaned back in surprise, while others leaned forward, intrigued. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing a story that would soon make headlines. Emily's lips parted. Dog?" The bailiff gave a small nod, his voice respectful. "This is justice." The German shepherd stood proudly, his ears alert yet relaxed, his eyes steady and kind. He wore a special harness with a polished badge stitched into the leather. But unlike the stern-faced officers who lined the courtroom, this guardian radiated peace. His tail gave a slow, reassuring wag as he approached. Emily froze, unsure at first. She had seen dogs before, friendly pets wagging through her neighborhood, strays barking in alleys, but none quite like this. There was something almost majestic about him, as though he carried with him not only strength, but also understanding. The handler, a tall woman in uniform, guided Justice closer. She knelt down and addressed Emily directly. "He's here for you," she said softly. "Justice is trained to stay by your side." He won't ask you any questions. He won't move unless you want him to. He's your friend, and he'll stay with you as long as you need. Emily's hands trembled as she reached out hesitantly. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath again. Her fingers brushed against Justice's fur-thick, warm, grounding. The dog didn't flinch, didn't move away. He simply leaned in slightly, as though inviting her touch, as though promising silently that he wasn't going anywhere. Something shifted in Emily's chest. For the first time that day, she felt the tightness inside her begin to ease. Her breathing slowed. Her shoulders relaxed just a little. The room didn't seem quite so enormous anymore, not with Justice filling the empty space beside her. A small, almost shy smile spread across her face. "He's soft," she whispered. The handler smiled. "Yes, and strong. And brave. Just like you." The judge watched the scene unfold, his heart softening. He had hoped the idea would work, but seeing it in practice was more powerful than he could have imagined. The child who moments ago could barely lift her head now looked steadier, more present, as though the very presence of the dog had built an invisible shield around her. The defense attorney rose quickly. "Your Honor," he began, his tone sharp, "this is highly irregular. Bringing an animal into court? It could influence the jury. It could prejudice the case." Judge Hamilton cut him off with a wave of his hand. His voice was firm, commanding. "What influences the jury is the truth. If this child requires support to tell that truth, then so be it. This courtroom exists to serve justice, and that," he said, glancing at the dog, "is exactly what we have here." The defense attorney sank back into his seat, defeated for the moment. The defendant clenched his jaw, his earlier smugness fading. For the first time, he looked uneasy. Emily, meanwhile, continued stroking Justice's fur. The dog settled comfortably beside her, lying at her feet with his head resting near her shoes. She could feel the warmth of his body, steady and calm. It was as though all the fear that had weighed her down had found a new anchor, a safe, loyal one. The prosecutor leaned forward slightly. "Emily," she asked gently, "do you think you could try again? This time, with Justice by your side?" Emily looked down at the dog. His big brown eyes met hers, steady and kind. She nodded slowly, her small voice firmer than before. "I think so." A ripple of relief spread through the courtroom. Her mother, sitting just behind her, wiped tears from her cheeks, her heart swelling with gratitude. The judge smiled softly, folding his hands. "Then we shall continue. Emily, you may begin whenever you're ready." And for the first time that day, the little girl sat up straighter, her fear no longer the loudest voice inside her. She wasn't alone anymore. Justice was there, and with him came the first spark of courage. The doors of the courtroom groaned as they swung fully open, revealing a scene that no one in attendance had expected. The bailiff led the way, his steps slow and deliberate, but it was the figure beside him that captured every gaze, silenced every murmur, and changed the very air of the room. Padding quietly into the chamber was a German shepherd, tall and strong, his fur gleaming under the lights. He wasn't just any dog, his presence radiated calm authority. His harness bore the insignia of the police, a shining badge stitched into the leather, glinting as though it carried the weight of both duty and compassion. The jurors leaned forward. Some spectators gasped audibly. Even the reporters, who had scribbled tirelessly since the trial began, froze mid-sentence, their pens hovering in the air. But no one's reaction compared to Emily's. Her wide, tear-brimmed eyes followed the dog's every step. Her trembling had not yet subsided, but something in her gaze shifted. Fear gave way to wonder. Confusion softened into awe. She sat straighter, her little hands resting nervously on the edge of her chair, as though afraid she might miss a single moment of what was unfolding. The handler, Officer Reyes, stopped near the witness stand and knelt beside Emily. Her voice was steady and warm. "Emily," she said gently, "this is Justice. He's a police dog, but more importantly, he's here for you. He doesn't want anything from you. He just wants to sit with you and keep you company." Emily's lips parted, and she whispered so softly only those closest could hear, "For me?" Officer Reyes nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. Only for you." Justice sat down beside Emily, his body close but not imposing. He lowered his head slightly, his ears relaxed, his eyes calm and steady. His tail gave a single slow wag, a signal of reassurance rather than excitement. Emily hesitated, her hand hovering above his back. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Then, with trembling fingers, she reached out and touched his fur. It was softer than she imagined, warm, thick, grounding. A tiny smile flickered across her face, so small most might have missed it, but to her mother, watching from the bench, it was a miracle. The little girl who had been moments from breaking down had just found her anchor. The judge watched silently, his expression softening. This was the shift he had hoped for, the crack of light breaking through Emily's wall of fear. He glanced briefly at the defense table, noting the defendant's growing unease. The man who once seemed untouchable now looked frustrated, his confidence wavering as the little girl found comfort where none had existed before. The prosecutor seized the moment carefully. Her voice was quiet, patient. "Emily," she said, "do you think you could try again? You don't have to do it alone now. Justice will be here with you the whole time." Emily stroked the dog's fur, her fingers relaxing with each pass. Justice leaned gently against her legs, a subtle but steady weight that grounded her in the present moment. She looked at the prosecutor, then at the judge, and finally back to Justice. His eyes met hers deep, unflinching, kind. She nodded. The room exhaled collectively, though the tension remained. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Your Honor," he barked. "This is absurd. Allowing an animal, especially one affiliated with law enforcement, into this courtroom could unfairly influence the jury. They may view this witness with undue sympathy, simply because of the presence of the dog." Judge Hamilton's gavel struck once, the crack reverberating like thunder. "Sit down, counselor," he said firmly. His eyes were sharp as they locked on to the defense attorney. "This court will not deny a child the support she needs to speak her truth. The jury will base their decision on her testimony, not on who or what gives her courage to tell it." The defense attorney gritted his teeth, but sank back into his chair. The judge turned his attention back to Emily. His tone softened again. "Emily, you may begin whenever you're ready. No rush. We are here to listen." Emily nodded once more. She looked down at Justice, her hand resting on his back. "You'll stay?" she whispered to him. Though her voice was so quiet, most thought she was talking to herself. Justice didn't move, didn't need to. His steady presence was answer enough. Her breathing slowed. Her heart still raced, but it no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a drumbeat pushing her forward. She sat a little taller in her chair, her fingers threading through the thick fur of her new companion. The prosecutor glanced at the judge, who gave a subtle nod. "Emily," the prosecutor began gently, "can you tell us what you remember? Just take your time." Emily opened her mouth, and though her voice cracked, words finally came. I was in my room." The entire courtroom leaned closer. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had heard before. Encouraged, she pressed her face briefly into Justice's neck, then lifted her head again. "I heard noises. I didn't know what it was, but I was scared. I peeked out, and... Her voice faltered, the memory flooding back. For a second, Her lips trembled, and silence threatened to swallow her again. But then she felt the justice's head shifting slightly, his steady weight against her legs, his warmth reminding her she wasn't alone. She exhaled and continued. I saw him. He was in our house. Gasps rippled quietly across the courtroom. The prosecutor glanced at the jury, noting their wide eyes, a pen scribbling frantically. Emily's words grew clearer, steadier. She described the moments that followed, what she saw, what she remembered. Her innocence was evident in the way she spoke, yet her words carried the sharp truth no one could ignore. The defendant's face tightened, his eyes darting nervously, the smugness completely gone. All the while, Justice remained unmoving. He didn't react to the tension, the gasps, or the heaviness of the testimony. He simply stayed with Emily, his presence like a shield. Her mother sobbed quietly from the back, covering her mouth with her hands. She had prayed endlessly for her daughter's strength to shine through, and now, with the help of a four-legged guardian, it was finally happening. When Emily finished her first account, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Her words, though spoken softly, rang louder than anything else in that chamber. The judge leaned forward, his voice gentle. Thank you, Emily. You are very brave. Emily reached down once more, burying her fingers in Justice's fur. And for the first time that day, her smile wasn't fleeting. It was steady, proud, and real. The little girl who had been silenced by fear had found her voice. And it had begun with the paw steps of a dog named Justice. The courtroom had shifted. What once felt heavy with silence and fear now pulsed with a new kind of energy. Emily sat straighter, her small fingers tangled in the thick fur of Justice, the police dog at her side. His steady presence had done something no human voice could. It had unlocked her courage. Everyone in the room felt it. The prosecutor leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle. Emily, thank you for sharing that with us. You're doing wonderfully. Now, when you saw the man in your house, what did he do? Emily's throat tightened at the question, but she kept her eyes fixed on Justice. His slow breathing grounded her, each rise and fall in his chest like a rhythm she could follow. She swallowed, then whispered, He went into the kitchen first. He was looking around. Her words carried further this time, reaching the jury without strain. The prosecutor nodded encouragingly. And then what happened, Emily? Emily shifted slightly, her hand pressing firmer into Justice's back. He saw me. I was trying to hide, but he saw me. The words trembled, but they came. The prosecutor allowed a moment of silence, letting Emily take control of the pace. The jurors leaned forward, pens poised, eyes wide with empathy. What did he do when he saw you? The prosecutor asked softly. Emily's lip quivered. For a heartbeat, the fear surged back, and her eyes darted toward the defendant. He stared at her with a coldness that made her shrink back. Justice lifted his head at that exact moment, pressing gently against her hand with his nose. Emily looked back down at him, and something inside her shifted again. The fear didn't disappear, but it no longer ruled her. Her voice came out steadier this time. He grabbed my arm. Gasps echoed through the room. Her mother broke into tears, quickly muffled by her hands. The jurors scribbled furiously, their faces hardening. And then? The prosecutor asked, her tone still patient, but stronger now, guiding Emily without overwhelming her. He told me not to scream, Emily whispered. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. She buried her face briefly in Justice's neck before continuing. But I did scream. I screamed anyway. The room hung on every word. The defendant shifted uncomfortably, his attorney tugging at his sleeve, whispering frantically. But Emily was beyond his shadow now. Her testimony poured out in fragments, frightened but vivid. She described the struggle, her fear, the sounds of her mother rushing in, and the chaos that followed. Every detail she gave painted a clearer picture, weaving together the story the prosecution needed the jury to see. By the time she finished her first long account, the air in the courtroom felt electric. A little girl's trembling voice had cut through every wall of denial the defense had tried to build. The prosecutor offered a small, grateful smile. "Emily, you've been very brave. Thank you." But the moment of relief was short-lived. The defense attorney rose, straightening his suit as he approached the witness stand. His expression was composed, but his eyes glinted with calculation. "Emily," he began, his tone unnervingly smooth, "you're very young, aren't you?" Emily shrank slightly in her chair, her grip on justice tightening. The prosecutor stood quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. Harassment of a minor witness." The judge raised a hand. "Overruled as long as the counselor remains respectful." The defense attorney smirked faintly before continuing. "Emily, sometimes when people are young, they get things confused. Do you think it's possible that you just imagined some of what happened?" Emily's eyes flickered with uncertainty. She looked down at Justice, who shifted closer, resting his head gently on her lap. The warmth of his weight reminded her. She wasn't alone, and she didn't need to doubt herself. "No," she said firmly, her voice surprisingly clear. "I didn't imagine it. It really happened." A ripple of approval spread through the jury box. The defense attorney's smirk faltered. He tried again. "But it was dark, wasn't it? Maybe you couldn't see clearly. Maybe it wasn't even the man sitting right over there." He gestured at his client, the defendant, whose jaw was tight with frustration. Emily took a shaky breath. She raised her hand slowly and pointed directly at the man in question. Her eyes, though brimming with tears, burned with certainty. "It was him. I know it was him." A courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge banged his gavel for silence, but even he could not mask the impact of that single, unwavering declaration. The defense attorney's face reddened. "Emily, are you sure?" He pressed, his voice sharper now. Emily glanced down at Justice once more, and this time, she didn't just stroke his fur. She leaned into him, drawing strength from the dog's calm, immovable presence. Her voice didn't waver as she replied, "Yes, I'm sure." The jurors exchanged looks, some nodding subtly. The prosecution's case had gained a new, undeniable weight. Frustrated, the defense attorney stepped back, muttering no further questions. The judge leaned forward. "Emily, you've been incredibly brave today. You may step down." As Emily slid off the chair, Justice rose with her, staying pressed to her side like a shadow. She walked back toward her mother, her small steps more confident than when she'd entered. The moment she reached her seat, her mother pulled her into a tearful embrace, whispering words of pride into her hair. The judge allowed a short recess. As the jury filed out, whispers filled the room, reporters scribbling furiously, spectators leaning in close to each other. The words brave, powerful, and unshakable passed from mouth to mouth. The prosecutor sat at her table, her expression calm, but her eyes alight. She knew what had just happened. Emily hadn't just testified. She had transformed the entire trial. Meanwhile, at the defense table, the attorney's frustration was palpable. His client leaned in, hissing angrily under his breath, his mask of confidence crumbling for the first time since the trial began. And in the middle of it all, Justice lay at Emily's feet, tail curled, eyes closed, as if he'd done nothing more than what can naturally be there when someone needed him most. What no one realized was that the trial was no longer just about legal arguments, evidence, or cross-examinations. It had become a battle of truth against fear, and thanks to a little girl's courage and the loyalty of a dog, truth had begun to shine through. For the first time since the trial started, Emily felt something she hadn't dared to hope for. Safe. Safe enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, justice wasn't just the name of the dog beside her. It was what was finally beginning to take shape in that courtroom. The courtroom returned from recess with an unspoken heaviness. Reporters shuffled back to their seats, pens at the ready, as whispers of Emily's testimony still echoed through the hallways outside. The jurors reassembled, their expressions sober, some eyes lingering on the little girl sitting close to her mother, justice curled protectively at her feet. The defendant sat stiffly at the defense table. His composure, once smug, almost untouchable, was cracking. The set of his jaw was rigid, his fingers tapped an erratic rhythm on the table, and his lawyer leaned in to calm him with whispered reassurances that carried no weight anymore. Judge Hamilton struck his gavel once. Court is back in session. Prosecution, you may proceed. The prosecutor rose with a new steadiness. Emily's testimony had not only survived the defense's attempt to discredit her, it had become the heartbeat of the case. But now, the time had come to strengthen that heartbeat with evidence. Your Honor, she began, the state calls Detective Marcus Holt to the stand. The courtroom doors opened again. This time not for a child or a dog, but for a man who carried the wear of years in law enforcement. Detective Holt took his seat with a calm authority. After being sworn in, he adjusted the microphone and looked toward the jury with clear, steady eyes. Detective Holt, the prosecutor began, can you walk us through the evidence collected at the crime scene? He nodded. We received the call late that night. When officers arrived, they found signs of forced entry scratches near the lock, shoe prints leading across the living room floor. We collected DNA samples, fingerprints, and fibers. The jurors scribbled furiously, each detail reinforcing Emily's story. The prosecutor's voice sharpened. And were you able to match those samples to anyone? Yes, Holt said simply, his eyes shifting briefly toward the defense table. They matched the defendant. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The defendant's face darkened, and he leaned back in his chair, as though the weight of the accusation pressed him down. His lawyer shot up immediately. Objection, Your Honor. This evidence is circumstantial. The judge raised a hand, his voice firm. Overruled. Continue, detective. The defense attorney sat down hard, his jaw tight. The prosecutor moved carefully now. Detective Holt, can you tell the court how confident you are in these matches? Beyond reasonable doubt, Holt replied. His tone carried no hesitation. The jury sat upright, their eyes flicking between the detective and the defendant. The web of truth was tightening, thread by thread. As Holt continued, Emily's small hand never left Justice's back. Though she was no longer on the stand, she watched intently, her little face pale but determined. Every word Holt spoke was a reminder that she had been believed, that she was not alone in her memories. But the defense was far from finished. When Holt's testimony concluded, the defense attorney rose, his voice sharp with urgency. Detective Holt, isn't it true that DNA evidence can sometimes be contaminated? That footprints can be misinterpreted? That fibers could belong to countless individuals? Holt's answer was steady. While anything can theoretically be challenged, the probability of contamination in this case is near zero. The chain of custody was airtight, and the evidence points consistently to the defendant. The defense attorney pressed harder, his voice rising with each question, trying desperately to chip away at certainty. But Holt didn't falter. His replies were measured, professional, and unwavering. The more the defense pushed, the more the jury shifted uncomfortably, as if watching someone try to argue against the obvious. And then came the mistake. Frustrated, the defense attorney slammed his hand on the table. You're making it sound as if my client had no choice but to be there that night. The words slipped out, harsher and louder than he intended. A stunned silence followed. Even the defendant turned his head sharply toward his lawyer, his eyes widening in fury. The jury perked up instantly, pens scribbling. The implication hung in the air, like smoke, as if my client had no choice but to be there. The prosecutor didn't miss a beat. Rising swiftly, she addressed the court. "Your Honor, the defense has just implied his client was at the scene. That is an admission we cannot ignore." The defense attorney sputtered, his face reddening. "That's not what I meant." But the judge's gavel cracked. "The court will note the counselor's statement. The jury may weigh it as they see fit." The defendant slammed his fist quietly against his knee, rage contorting his face. Justice's ears flicked up at the sound, but he remained calm, leaning closer to Emily, as though shielding her from the outburst. The trial was slipping away from the defense, and everyone in the room knew it. The prosecutor sat back, her lips pressed into the faintest smile. Emily's testimony had laid the foundation. Holt's evidence had built the walls. And the defense, in their own slip of frustration, had begun to place the roof. Still, the day was not over. The defense attorney, red-faced but determined, requested to call his own witnesses. The judge granted it, and soon, the courtroom watched as a neighbor of the defendant took the stand, trying to provide an alibi. But cracks appeared almost instantly. Times didn't match. Details contradicted earlier statements, and under cross-examination, the witness faltered. Each failure only made the jury's focus sharper. Each contradiction made Emily's quiet, steady testimony shine brighter in hindsight. Through it all, justice remained at Emily's side. Every time her eyes darted nervously at the defendant's glares, she found comfort in the dog's immovable calm. To the jury, that image was unforgettable. The small girl, fragile but unbroken, anchored by a loyal German shepherd who seemed to embody the very concept of justice itself. As the afternoon waned, the judge called for another recess. The jurors filed out once more, the atmosphere heavy with what they had heard. Emily rested her head briefly against Justice's neck, whispering softly, "Thank you." Though he could not reply, his slow, steady breathing seemed to answer anyway. Her mother stroked her hair, tears in her eyes but a smile on her lips. "You did it, baby. You really did it." The prosecutor, gathering her notes, glanced at Emily and the dog, her expression softening. "You've given this jury something they'll never forget," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. And indeed, the image of a little girl finding her voice beside a silent, steadfast guardian was etched into every mind in that courtroom. The trial was far from over, but the truth once buried under fear and silence was now unraveling in front of everyone's eyes. And it had begun, not with raised voices or damning arguments, but with a child's courage and the quiet presence of a dog named Justice. The air in the courtroom grew heavier with each passing day. The trial that had begun with silence and hesitation had transformed into a battleground of truth and denial. Now, as the final stages arrived, everyone knew the stakes. The jury's decision would not only decide the defendant's fate, but also determine whether Emily's voice had truly been heard. On the morning of the closing arguments, Emily arrived with her mother, her small frame tucked protectively into the woman's side. Justice padded beside them, his steps slow and deliberate, his tail swaying lightly as though he could feel the weight of the day. When Emily walked into the courtroom, the jurors glanced her way almost instinctively. The image of her testimony still lingered in their minds. The child who had pointed at her abuser without hesitation, shielded by the silent strength of a German shepherd. The judge entered, and all rose. Once seated, he looked out at the tense room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you will hear closing arguments. Remember, what the attorneys say is not evidence, but their interpretation of the evidence you've been presented. Listen carefully." The prosecutor rose first, moving slowly to the center of the room. She carried no notes in her hands. Her case had already been written in the trembling words of a child and in the irrefutable evidence Detective Holt presented. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, "this case is not about imagination. It is not about confusion. It is about a little girl who faced her worst nightmare and still found the courage to tell us the truth." She gestured gently toward Emily, who sat quietly beside her mother, justice resting at her feet. "You saw her fear. You saw her strength. And you saw how the defendant tried to silence her with intimidation. But despite all of that, she pointed at him and said the words we all needed to hear. It was him." The prosecutor let the silence linger. Some jurors nodded slightly, their eyes still fixed on Emily. "We have the DNA. We have the footprints. We have the fibers. And most importantly, we have a witness who told the truth even when it was hard to speak at all. That is courage. That is credibility. That is justice." Her hand hovered over the defense table briefly. "Don't let him take that from her again. Find him guilty." She returned to her seat, her expression composed, her hand briefly brushing Emily's shoulder as if to say, "You did this." The defense attorney rose quickly, tugging his suit jacket into place. His expression was controlled, but sweat beaded faintly at his brow. He knew the case had slipped from his grip. The desperation made him bolder. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, pacing in front of them, "children can be mistaken. Children can be coached. They can imagine things that never happened." He gestured sharply toward Emily, though careful not to look directly at her. "Do we really want to send a man to prison for life based on the testimony of someone so young?" The jury shifted, some frowning at the insinuation. The defense attorney pressed harder. "Yes, evidence was collected, but evidence can be contaminated. DNA can be mishandled. Footprints can be misinterpreted. Ask yourselves, do you truly have no doubt? Because reasonable doubt is all it takes." He stopped, his voice lowering in a calculated tone. "And what about the dog? A police dog in the courtroom?" He gestured sharply at justice. "Is that fair? Did that not sway your emotions? Did that not make you see this child as braver than she really is?" The words struck like sparks, but they fizzled as quickly as they lit, because even as he spoke them, justice shifted slightly, resting his head against Emily's leg. She leaned into him instinctively, her small hand tightening around his fur. The image, raw, real, uncoached, was more powerful than any accusation the defense could throw. The defense attorney's voice faltered. He swallowed hard, muttered his final appeal for fairness, and returned to his seat. The judge dismissed the jury to deliberate. As they filed out, the room grew eerily quiet. Reporters tapped at their keyboards, parents whispered to each other, and Emily sat small in her chair, one hand on Justice's back, her eyes wide with worry. Her mother bent close, whispering, "You did everything you could, sweetheart. Everything." Emily nodded, but her voice trembled when she whispered back, "What if they don't believe me?" Justice lifted his head, nuzzling her hand, as if answering her doubt with silent certainty. The steady rhythm of his breathing calmed her enough to rest against her mother's side. Hours dragged by. The jury deliberated in a room just down the hall, their voices muffled behind thick wooden doors. Inside the courtroom, time seemed frozen. The prosecutor organized her files with calm hands, but tense shoulders. The defense attorney scribbled furiously, his client glaring at the table as if sheer will could change the outcome. Emily sat quietly, sometimes leaning against Justice, sometimes staring at the floor, her small legs swinging slightly from the bench. She was tired, but the dog's warmth kept her anchored. Finally, the bailiff entered. "The jury has reached a verdict." The words rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. Everyone scrambled to their feet as the jurors filed back in. Emily's mother squeezed her daughter's hand tightly, whispering prayers under her breath. Emily pressed both hands into Justice's fur, her heart racing. The foreperson of the jury stood, holding the slip of paper that held the answer. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" The judge asked. "We have, Your Honor." The paper was handed over, read silently by the judge, and then returned. He looked out over the courtroom, his voice deep and steady. In the matter of the state versus James R. Callahan, the defendant's name echoed across the chamber, heavy and damning. "We, the jury, find the defendant." The silence was unbearable. Emily's breath hitched, her mother's hand tightening painfully around hers. Even Justice lifted his head, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. "Guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted gasps, cries, reporters scrambling for words. Emily's mother broke into tears, clutching her daughter tightly. Emily herself sat frozen for a moment, processing the words. Then she buried her face in Justice's neck, sobbing into his fur, her little body shaking not from fear this time, but from the release of it. The defendant exploded from his chair, shouting angrily, his attorney tugging at his sleeve, trying to hold him back. Bailiffs swarmed instantly, restraining him, dragging him from the courtroom as he yelled incoherent threats. The judge's gavel slammed repeatedly until the noise subsided. When silence finally returned, all that remained was the sound of Emily's quiet sobs and the steady breathing of the dog who had never left her side. The judge's voice softened as he looked toward her. "Emily," he said, "you are one of the bravest witnesses this court has ever seen. Justice has been served, thanks in no small part to you." The little girl lifted her head, her cheeks streaked with tears, her hands still gripping Justice. For the first time in months, she smiled, a small, tired, but genuine smile. Justice wagged his tail once, as though in agreement. And in that moment, everyone in the courtroom realized that justice had been more than a verdict. It had been the courage of a child, the truth she carried, and the silent strength of a dog who had stood by her through it all. The courtroom had emptied, leaving behind only echoes of the day's extraordinary events. Chairs were pushed back into place, papers shuffled across tables, and the once tense air now seemed lighter, almost reverent. But for Emily and her mother, the experience of the trial had left an indelible mark, a mix of relief, exhaustion, and a cautious hope that life could return to something resembling normal. Emily walked slowly toward the exit, her small fingers laced tightly with her mother's. Justice padded at her side, his steady presence grounding her every step. Outside, the bright sunlight reflected off the courthouse steps, warming her face, and for the first time in months, feeling safe in the world beyond those walls. Her mother stopped and knelt to Emily's level, brushing stray strands of hair from her forehead. "You did it, Emily. You spoke your truth. You were so brave." Emily nodded silently, her eyes wide but reflective. She pressed her hand into Justice's thick fur, feeling the warmth and steady heartbeat beneath her fingers. "I couldn't have done it without him," she whispered softly. Her mother smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "No, sweetheart, you couldn't, but you also found something inside yourself, something strong, something brave. And justice helped you see that." The dog wagged his tail lightly, nudging Emily gently, as if acknowledging her words. His role in the trial had been quiet, almost invisible to some, but for Emily, it had been monumental. He had not only provided comfort, he had been the bridge between fear and courage, between silence and truth. In the days that followed, news of the trial and the little girl who had faced her fears went viral. Reporters from all over the country covered the story, sharing images of Emily sitting on the witness stand with justice curled at her feet. Headlines praised her bravery, highlighted the role of therapy and support animals, and celebrated the unlikeliest of courtroom heroes, a police dog named Justice. Emily's mother received phone calls from friends, family, and strangers alike, all offering words of encouragement. "Your daughter is remarkable," one caller said. "I cried reading about her courage. That dog is a hero too." But for Emily, the fame was less important than the quiet moments she shared with Justice at home. Each morning, she would stroke his fur while sipping her breakfast. Each night, she would curl up beside him, finding safety in his steady breathing. And in those moments, the nightmares that had once gripped her no longer held power. Therapy sessions, once daunting and filled with tears, became opportunities for Emily to practice storytelling, to explore her feelings, and to regain the confidence that trauma had nearly stolen from her. Justice's presence was permitted in many of these sessions, allowing Emily to speak freely without fear of judgment. One afternoon, during a particularly difficult session, Emily recounted the moments on the witness stand, the fear, the trembling, and the relief of finding Justice by her side. She paused, pressing her forehead against the dog's soft neck. "He made me brave," she whispered, her voice steady. The therapist nodded, a small smile forming. "He didn't make you brave, Emily. You were brave all along. He just reminded you of it when you couldn't remember." Emily hugged Justice tightly, feeling the warmth of his fur seep into her bones. It was a reminder that courage didn't always roar, sometimes rested quietly in the presence of a loyal friend. At school, Emily returned to her classmates. Some were curious, some were awed by her story, and a few didn't know how to react. But she carried herself differently, now not with fear, but with a quiet confidence. Justice could not attend school, but she drew strength from the thought that bravery could come in many forms, and that her voice mattered. Meanwhile, the legal community took note of the trial. Judges, attorneys, and lawmakers discussed the precedent set by allowing a support animal in the courtroom. Training programs for therapy, and police dogs received renewed attention. And Emily's story became a case study in how empathy, courage, and unconventional support could empower victims, especially children, to testify without fear. Back at home, Emily often sat in the backyard, Justice lying close, the sun casting long shadows across the grass. Her mother would bring lemonade or cookies, sitting on the steps to watch them. Emily would stroke the dog's fur and recount her day, her small voice calm and sure. One evening, as the golden sun dipped behind the horizon, Emily whispered to her mother, "Do you think people will always remember Justice?" Her mother smiled gently, brushing Emily's hair from her face. "They will, sweetie. But more importantly, you'll always remember him. And every time you feel scared, you'll remember what it felt like to be brave." Emily nodded thoughtfully, resting her head against Justice once more. "I think I will." The dog let out a soft sigh, almost as if agreeing, and nudged her gently with his nose. Weeks turned into months. Emily's nightmares decreased, her confidence grew, and her ability to express her feelings blossomed. The courtroom experience, once terrifying, had become a defining chapter in her life, not because of the fear, but because of the courage she discovered within herself and the unwavering support she had received from a four-legged friend. The trial itself became a story told in schools, in legal seminars, and across social media platforms. But Emily's mother always reminded people that the true hero of the story was not just Emily, though she had been undeniably brave, but also Justice, who had provided a presence that words alone could not. One quiet afternoon, Emily stood in the living room, brushing Justice's fur. She looked up at her mother and said, "I think I'm ready to help other kids like me." Her mother's eyes widened. "Really?" "Yes," Emily said firmly. "I want them to know they can be brave too. And that sometimes help comes in the quietest, furriest forms." Her mother smiled through tears. "I think that's a wonderful idea." And in that moment, Emily's story one of fear, courage, and the extraordinary bond between a child and a dog continued to unfold beyond the courtroom. She had found her voice, the truth had prevailed, and the memory of justice, sitting steadfastly by her side, would live in her heart forever. Justice, unaware of the headlines and accolades, simply wagged his tail and nuzzled Emily, as he always did, content in the knowledge that he had been exactly where he was needed most. For Emily, life had changed. Fear no longer held her captive. Courage no longer seemed distant. And justice, in its quiet, steadfast form, had arrived not only in the verdict of a courtroom, but in the heart of a little girl and the loyalty of a police dog named Justice. The bond they shared, forged under extraordinary circumstances, would remain unbroken, a testament to the quiet strength that can emerge when compassion, courage, and love meet. And so, the story ended not with fanfare, but with peace. A little girl, a faithful dog, and a mother who had watched her daughter grow into her own kind of hero. The world would remember the headlines, but they would never forget the courage that had inspired them all.